Hi everyone. So the last time that I spoke at the ILMC was at a panel on green events back in 2007, and that was a very optimistic time. And I'm going to make a confession, which is that I was part of the team that helped to write the British standards 8901 that formed the basis for international standard ISO 2012-1, which I've been told I'm not allowed to talk about because this panel is about action and not paperwork. So we'll just move forward from that and just think about some of the other things that were going on at the time. One of the things that I did was a carbon footprint of, for the first ever time at Wembley Stadium, of the memorial concert for Princess Diana, 70,000 people. There was a Live Earth concert series, and so there was this real feeling that we could change the events industry, and it was exciting, And since 2007. A lot has changed, and there's some new approaches to changing behaviour and disrupting complacency, if you like. So one of the things is, I don't know if you're familiar with nudge theory. Have you heard of this? So nudge theory is, I'll give you a well-known example, that in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, at the men's urinal, apparently notoriously quite dirty urinal, they painted a tiny fly on each urinal. And apparently the spillage rates dropped by 80% overnight because the men started aiming at these flies. So the reason I mention that is because, so that's a different approach than this kind of very heavy-handed fining people or trying to change behavior in a very obvious way. But a lot hasn't changed since 2007 because we're still having some of the same conversations. We're still talking about the need to change behavior, the need to disrupt the status quo. And frankly, all of us need to do a hell of a lot to become more sustainable. Otherwise, our major cities are going to be underwater in the future. So there is a huge amount to do. But to help talk about, their own experiences, we've got our panel here. And so I'm just going to introduce each of you quickly, and then I'll hand over to Livy to kick off. So Livy is a sustainable events consultant at Canberra Events, and they do festival consultancy. And you work with Shambhala. Yeah, Shambhala Festival. And Hamish Skirmer, who some of you may have seen from his TEDx talk, which I saw. And Hamish founded Natural Event and the Folk Rhythm and Life Festival, and invented a composting toilet system in 2000, right? Which has been used everywhere from Glastonbury to Haiti. Is that correct? Yeah. And Steve, hi, nice to meet you. And you produce Green Gathering, is that right? Yeah. And Rob, from many years' experience at Glastonbury and also RPS Conservation. You've been working with festivals for about 18 years, I think, and I think over 20 years in sustainability. So each of the panelists is going to talk about their practical and personal experiences for disrupting complacency. I'm going to hand over to you, Livy, to start.
Hi everyone, so I'm going to be talking about Shambhala Festival and our initiative for 2016, which is that we're going meat and fish free. So, as I'm sure a lot of you know, Shambhala is committed to sustainability. It is now 100% renewable energy. It's carbon net positive. In 2013, it went plastic bottle free. So it's always in the forefront of what else can we do, and food is a big issue. We're very, very stringent on what traders can bring on site. We have a very strict list that they have to work through. And when we were last year, I was working with them a lot to go through the meat and who their producers were and who their providers were. And I was looking through these websites and checking, and it was really unclear as to what the standards that people were working to within the meat industry. And we had instances where although we'd said, that they should use our local supplier, it sort of was reported back that potentially people were actually only using a minimal amount from our supplier and maybe getting things from elsewhere. And on top of that, we're really aware of the impact of meat on the environment. So the stats sort of from, I think it's Chatham House, have said that it's 14.5% of the world's greenhouse gases come from livestock production and transport, which is actually more than the transport industry in the world. So whilst we've done all these measures, actually the real way to sort of actually spark a debate about this and actually address it is to go meat-free. So we've made that decision, and what it's really sort of brought up when we announced it on social media was all of these very ingrained beliefs that we have as a society about eating meat. And it was really interesting sort of the way that people came back and sort of fed back to the Facebook group, and people were coming up with all sorts of funny things like, we're going to a festival, it's not a nanny state, it's about freedom of expression, and now you're controlling what we eat. I remember in 2011, I bought a can of Coke at your festival, and what are you going to do about glitter? And it really kind of was... So, the girl who's doing social media, Becca, was, we were just sort of like, wow, really, kind of a bit scraping the barrel. But it really, really highlights the issue we have in this country and in very Western cultures about meat being part of our rights. And it kind of fits in with some sort of behaviour change or behaviour models that are really ingrained as humans in people's psyche, that sort of loss aversion and the ideas of scarcity. So suddenly the thought that not being able to have meat for 4 days, sort of is something about, our personal rights. But we are forging ahead with it, obviously. We're not going dairy-free because it's like, one step. And the same as with the bottle campaign. So we've got a positive social norming campaign called Bring a Bottle, which whilst we went plastic free, we said bring your own bottle along. So what we're doing with the meat campaign is it's very positive. We've got lots of really amazing food producers on site. We're going to have an area called the Garden of Feeden, and there'll be lots of debates there. So we're going to bring in people who are supplying meat, who are doing organic, who are doing locally sourced. We're going to really, spark these debates and have these conversations, because what I don't know if anyone's watched Cowspiracy, but the real a lot of these conversations are the ones that people aren't prepared to have, and the environmental organisations aren't prepared to say, actually, if you really care about the environment, you need to cut down on your meat intake. So we're kind of spearheading again ahead and actually having that conversation to see whether people will change their behaviours, or whether we can just actually talk to people, and people. I mean, the interesting thing with Shambhala is that the community actually sort of, speaks for itself. And one of the things on the social media was people were feeding back to these people who were saying, oh, God, I want a refund and blah, blah, blah. And they were actually kind of giving, very reasoned arguments by actually cutting down meat is, is not unreasonable for 4 days. And actually, for the longer term good of the planet, it's, the way to go.
Hello. Okay, so... I started my own music festival with a group of fine people in Australia when I was 22, so it's over 20 years ago. And at the time I was studying environmental science. And no qualms in saying I was very altruistic, very much an idealist, 22-year-old environmental science festival-loving kind of guy. And... right there and then I realised that when you put on your own festival, self-declared mayor of utopia, because you're creating a world, a bubble, and the name of our property is called Bilyana, and I still call it the Bilyana bubble, where we get to do and say anything we want, because in fact we are the mayor or any hierarchical societal structure you like. And being 22, I love the title of this talk, Disrupting Complacency. And I'm going to draw upon some of my experiences to let you know how I felt as though I might have done that or participated in that. So decided early on that we would have a philosophy-based festival. So rather than a cultural or an economic platform, we were like, this is our philosophies and this is how we're going to represent this. And we talked our asses off for months. And it was like this full-on thing. We'd meet monthly, and then it was fortnightly, and then every week. And before it was the first one was happening, we're just talking and idealism, and then we realised we'd just spent a week talking about what colour the toilet paper was going to be, and we're like, we need to get real and pick our battles. So that was one thing that we did. Instead of philosophising on every single component, we brought it all down, and we started our festival, and we decided to do a non-profit festival where we aimed an ambition to donate money away to different groups, namely Youth Outdoor Education Centre. And the testimony is that last year when we did our festival, we gave away $100,000. So that was cool, and that was the second or third year in a row. Now, as a festival director of that festival, I outrightly refused to use portaloos. Just said no, it's just not going to happen. And the reason is because they're absolutely vile and rank. And I've got no qualms, and if you're in the business of portaloos, I'll see you outside, mate. So anyway, I don't like them personally, right? Technologically, they're retarded. They're for building sites. They're not for music festivals. And what I discovered was a way of doing composting toilets. So we did it. And we came up with it, and we went ahead. And then my local council came along and said, you're a very naughty little boy, and fined me. And then the next year, I did it again. And said, come, and then I said, I'm not going to pay that fine. They said, if you don't pay the fine, we're going to take you to the magistrate's court. And I said, take me to court, because I will go to jail for the right of keeping 18 wheelie bins on my property. I'll do it. How long, will you lock me up for 10 minutes? How long is it going to be? Just loved the martyr story, and I was totally willing to do that because I was 23. I'm like, bring it on. I don't care what you say. So disrupting complacency, bring it sort of to... actually, in that time, I had a vision, and that was that we would affect some of the biggest festivals in Australia, the ones that I knew, and at that time, we built the toilets in September, and the first festival that used them was in December. And I knew, in the year 2001 actually, I knew that I'd bring them to Glastonbury. And this is a humble little bush festival in Victoria, and I went, Pop! So how to disrupt complacency is to have a vision, to have a soulful vision that has you in the future. Understand you can relate to your future self by engaging in a future memory that has you in a different time and place. And you want to do something, and then figure out what are the barriers to that, and then prioritise them. Because bureaucratic agreement with what you're doing is the last thing. Now, in contrast to what Steve's talking about, just past, with absolute respect, and also majorly to all of the people who treat bureaucratic approval to what you do as the number one reason of doing something. The thing is that when coming up with the pioneering idea as a composting toilet for a large amount of people, because everyone who'd ever done a composting toilet before was for 5 or 10 people. Now, that technology, as designed by whomever over a long period of time, completely inappropriate for a music festival, just like a portaloo is. Because they're designed for a domestic application, and no one had ever come up with a festival toilet ever. No one prior to what we had done had said, here is a toilet specifically for a festival. So I came over to England 2008. And when I came over, I said to myself, I'm going to light a fire, and it's going to be a wildfire that's going to be impossible to put out over Europe, and that is, I will show you the highs and lows. The highs and lows, and I'll call the British public because that's where we are. You have very, very high tolerance of a very, very low expectation of what a toilet's going to be like. You do. It's ridiculous. You're like, this is the most amazing experience, and I've had this communality with all of these people, and I'm so inspired by everything, and the decor's amazing, and quite frankly, that band just blew me away, and I found love and everything, and it's all beautiful. And then I'm going to be miserable for 10 minutes every day. But that's okay, because that's what festivals are about, innit? So, innit? I love festival, I love hating the toilet, I love misery. I'm like, that's crazy. So I think there was a complacency amongst both the stakeholders, which are festival directors, and the receivers, or as I like to call them, the people who consume the tofu burgers, is... that you don't have to be miserable. So when dealing with complacency, technological change was something that I brought in. Now, it's so simple it's a composting toilet, that people couldn't believe that it was better. And the other one as well is, and I know if Steve's still in the room, due respect, is that, and also to Peter Noble, who was talking here before, I've tried to talk to Peter. I haven't met him here in England, which is crazy. Tried to talk to him for 15 years about it. Oh, no. And I just spoke just then. I said, Pete, what is the problem about actually conversing with me? We can't have composting toilets because we're near the sea level and you can't dig holes. I said, we don't dig any holes. He said, well, let's do it then. I'm like, man, that was 15 years to meet you in a lobby and just like complacency. Like ignorance is complacent when people surround themselves with ignorance. And may I add a little bit of ego that you know best because you're also omnipotent festival director. You can get mixed up a little bit and you can get really hooked into you're the boss, you know the best, as opposed to actually someone who focuses specifically on something called composting on the largest scale ever, right? So yeah, I do believe that, and I will pass on. The disrupting complacency though, if I had listened to bureaucratic approval processes before I did anything, it simply would not have occurred. Simple. Because when people made the rules, no one ever thought in their wildest dreams that someone would come up with an idea of such large scale impact of composting toilets. Computer says no. What happened in this country? I did it anyway. 3 years later, they retro-approved me and under the table said, we're going to ignore the fact that you worked outside of the rules for 3 years. Here's your rule permit. Thank you very much, I said. And then developed again 5 years later, and then they retro-approved my new system. So what I'm saying is to disrupt complacency is to have an actual real connection based on real facts and real knowledge, not hopeful sales, say the quid here, madam. It's the reality of dealing with a composting toilet system on a huge scale that I was aware of before bureaucrats allowed me and certainly before festival directors agreed with me.
Good afternoon, can you hear me all? Right, yeah, I'm Steve from the Green Gathering, formerly the Big Green Gathering, and the aspect of this I'd like to look at today is how we sort of manage disrupting complacency. So the Green Gathering, if you don't know about it, is probably the biggest collection of activists, green activists, and therefore very opinionated people under canvas that I've ever come across. That means that really every aspect of what we do is challenged at some point or the other. So, I mean, to begin with, looking at complacency, what is complacency? Now, I've been involved with festivals since, say, the early 80s, so over the 30 years, there's been a lot of different complacencies and a lot of cultural changes. And these seem to fall into three basic categories. What I call autocratic imposition, i.e. a condition is imposed on the event by a local authority or some other outside body that you are required to implement on your site. And what I call elective policy initiatives, i.e. something that you as an event and a community decide you want to do. There's also another trend which is evolutionary change, but that's not very disruptive because that happens over a period of time and reflects other social mores. So I'll focus on the first. So, I mean, executive autocratic implementation. Always the most difficult to deal with, especially when you're dealing with a group of neo-anarchists, because their essential reaction is, we don't want this, and this isn't, and of course you understand they are not going to take this to the authors of this imposition, they are going to take it to us. Unlike the omnipotent directors you've come across, we are at all times entirely fallible and subject to accountability. So it's a little bit of a coconut shy. We sort of have an inverse relationship like that. But what I would say is it's how you arrive at the need for the disruption and how you manage it. Now earlier nudge theory was mentioned, and I think although we wouldn't use that, in a similar vein, we would be looking at soft implementation with alternative enablement, i.e. if something has to change, you need to explain why, and then you need to make real, credible alternatives to that behaviour easily available to people so that they can change that behaviour. Just trying to impose a change because you're passing it on down the line tends to meet resistance. Now you can make this happen by any number of means, but the best way to make this happen is to actually sign up and engage your community and your customers and your crew with the change. So that brings us on to the more I mean, the compliance requirements are generally more of a challenge to some of the managerial aspects than they are the cultural aspects. As a green community and a green gathering, we have a number of policies which effectively are elective initiatives. I mean, many years ago, we decided we were only running everything on solar and wind. That excludes biodiesel, any form of diesel generator. Now, in order to achieve cultural changes, it's necessary to engage the people it's going to affect. Now, I don't know the structure of other festivals. We have always had a democratic accountability mechanism. Certainly with the old larger company, the Big Green Gathering, we had annually elected directors at AGMs and a steering group and frequent meetings to discuss any initiatives. It's only when you've secured the support of the community for something that you'll begin to implement it. Generally, once you've got to that stage, there is very little resistance to implementation. I mean, at previous sessions, I've heard about the problems of litter, left tents. We never have that problem. When we've had community policemen on site, I say, look, there is no litter. We do not fine people. We do not have a punitive solution to this. What we do is ensure that there are very many recycling points and waste disposal points for people to use. People police themselves once they have accepted by consensus that a certain policy is necessary. Now, this is going to be more challenging for some events than others, but as a green group, we have democratic structure and politics built into our DNA. So, you know, as Hamish says, we can, in fact, discuss things, you know, until everyone has actually lost the plot of what we were originally trying to arrive at. So you actually have to have a balance between democratic accountability and effective implementation. So with the policy, for example, of only using solar and wind, that was not a difficult policy to arrive at. In the early days, it was a difficult policy to implement because of the lack of actual equipment to do that. That is not the case now. You know, we have more than adequate numbers of people to provide that. But what you find is that once you actually have once that complacency is initially disrupted, the people that are disrupted become your biggest enforcers. I remember a few years ago, for example, when, I mean, the extent of our ban on generators meant that we would search every vehicle entering the site for unauthorised generators. If you couldn't clear it with a person that had booked it, it was going to get impounded and you were going to get it back at the end. Now, some people might think that interventionist. And certainly for a green event, well, that's counterintuitive to a neo-anarchist group of people actually wanting implementation, and quite executive too. But when we missed, or by, I don't know how it arose, but somehow a generator got on site one year. It's only a small generator, and as usual, it was for a completely frivolous purpose, i.e. cooling someone's lager in a bar, you know, which is not the most important thing. When this was discovered, we had to handle a near riot by our solar providers and our wind providers because that policy had not been 100% implemented. We were made aware of it. We didn't notice it. It was actually our crew and customers who were bringing it to our attention and then expecting us to do something about it. So currently we have a production company that is owned by a charity. So to keep the democratic process alive, we have a system whereby if people are upset with the way the event is run or a particular policy initiative, they feed that to trustees. The trustees then talk to the managers of the production company, and then we will look at how we can amend the way it's being implemented or whether a policy initiative is actually working. Now, once you've got to that stage, as you say, you get very little resistance. The limit of the accountability being that once we have decided that policy, the actual management company, we have a production company called Optimistic Trout, which produces the event for the Green Gathering charity. Once we've established policy, it's going to be implemented. So there's no point having a row with a steward or a director at the event because we are implementing agreed policy. And that's what we will say to people. If you have a real problem with the policy, here is the accountability mechanism. Get involved, put your case, and there's a good chance it will change things. And that's the other important thing, not only engaging the community, but communicating. So you communicate the necessity for impositions, and you communicate the vision behind what I termed voluntary initiatives in terms of policy. Once that's communicated, then you really have very little problem with people feeling unhappy about the disruption, because they accept it is for the common good. I mean, people have often referred to our event as cat herding, and I say, well, you know, the trick is not to herd cats, but to guide cats to their best possible outcome without them necessarily realising they are being guided. And in the way you set up the site and the way you respond to it, you know, yeah, so it does govern dynamics. So as alternative as people think they are, there are some conventions about their behaviour. What I have observed is there is nothing more conservative, with a small c, than alternative counterculture. Like, some people come back and they're as anarchists as the day is long, but they want to park under the same tree as they have done for the past 10 years, you know. And if they can't, there's all hell to pay. So, you know, you have to sometimes explain that things do change. So really what I'm trying to say is that in order to minimise the disruption to whichever complacency you're challenging, you have to engage your community, and you have to give them a very real sense that their engagement is actually worthwhile. There's no point setting up a paper committee that then just talks and issues conclusions to a vacuum. People need to see there's an account. Now, we have feedback, and our feedback we need to take seriously. And some events won't have democratic accountability. They won't have bodies that represent the crew and the customers. That's quite unusual. You know, the more commercial organisations will find this more challenging, which is why they will persist in having these problems. Because if you treat people like punters, they're going to behave like them. If you give people a stake, and this is what it's about, a stakeholdership in the event, if they can see their ideas and their behaviour improving the event, you're more likely to get that to continue. And that's what I think the challenge is, in basically engaging your community to support what you do. Now, I do accept that as a smaller event, and a purist event, it's a little easier for us to do that than, say, if you're a big commercial event with tens of thousands of people. But it's sort of a mindset. So with our feedback forms, they will have 2 or 3 salient things that we'll pick up. One of them, in fact, was compost loos. In fact, our feedback demanded them. It wasn't that we imposed them. Our customers actually required us to do them. So I guess what I'm going to conclude by saying is that really it's democratic engagement, stakeholdership, and then communication of the rationale behind the policy. If you do that, people feel engaged, and they don't feel as if it's just a bunch of remote people telling them what to do because they're getting off on the power trip.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much, Steve. Thanks.
I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. So, yeah. So we've got Livy and Steve who represent festivals that are already, they're already strong on these issues anyway, and they're trying to push the boundaries further. And I work with a lot of different festivals. And I've worked on festivals that are like that, and I also work with festival organisers where this is quite low down on their list of things. And the way I see complacency in that sense is, if you're talking to quite often you're trying to retrofit this type of stuff into an existing event, because something like the Green Gathering or Shambhala or the Croissant Neuf Summer Party that I used to work on, we started off the festival with green in mind. It was from the ground up, everything that you did was meant to be sustainable. Whereas if you go to an existing event that's maybe decided that this is an issue that they need to tackle, but they've really not done it before, how do you deal with that? How do they deal with that? Their complacency is they've built up a successful event already. They've taken a lot of risks in doing that, and now they've got to the point where actually they're quite comfortable. They've taken the risks. They've got to this nice point where everything's working. Why should they change it? Hang on. Go back to them. So the main fears you're going to get from the organisers, from the promoters of these festivals, is what's the audience going to think about it? If you impose some kind of new regime on the audience, impose some kind of system that affects their behaviour, are they going to like it? If they don't like it, are they going to come back next year? Are you going to sell any tickets? Are there going to be operational issues with it? Are you going to, if you change the way your festival operates on the ground? There's a lot of complacency in the management of the festival on the ground, and in the suppliers and contractors. They've done the same thing every year. You rock up with your compost toilets, and the the power contractor says, why do you need electricity for your compost toilets? They're because they haven't taken any notice of the specification that's been provided. They've just assumed everything's carrying on as normal, how it was before. So how do you challenge this? How do you make it work? Because the sustainability issue is what you're trying to tackle, but you have to make it work for the promoters and for the audience. If you don't, then the event is not going to work. So the main thing, and Steve touched on this as well, is just try and make it easy for the audience and make it a nicer experience for the audience. They actually want to do it. So instead of telling them, in a way, I disagree to a certain extent with some of the things that have been said just now about having this really expanded communication with the audience and trying to involve them in the discussion. That's absolutely brilliant for audiences that are already interested in that. But people who come to the Green Gathering, who come to conferences like this. Ben from Arcadia was talking about this in the break earlier on. To a certain extent, you're preaching to the converted. What about the people who aren't converted? So, just do it basically. But you need to come up with systems that will change these things without the audience necessarily being aware of it. And Steve touched on that actually when he was talking about his. Not shepherding the cats, but making them think they got there under their own volition. So the main things really is it's all about communication internally, I think, and making sure that well, first let me go to a picture. So there's an issue. You've got an issue. So here's an issue. What's in that bin? What's in that bin is mostly cups from the bar. These are paper cups. They could be plastic ones. I worked out that 400 empty cups is going to fill a bin. If you're on a busy event, a successful event that the promoter's built up for years, you're selling sometimes 10,000 drinks an hour over that bar by the main stage, and that bin's full in about 2 minutes. Nobody's going to come and empty it till the end of the day. Then, so you've got your waste disposal problem, you've got your litter problem. So what do you do about it? You want to use reusable cups. Then you come up against the issues of dealing with the existing suppliers, the people who run the bars. The promoters will be asking the question, will my audience like this? Do they want to use them? So these are all things that I think can be dealt with internally. So you need to communicate with the people who are providing these services and make it easy for them, make sure everybody understands the systems that are being used. And in terms of disrupting complacency, I've mentioned a little bit about the reusable cups. So at Glastonbury, I was involved last year with developing a reusable cup system for Glastonbury. And most reusable cup systems use hard plastic cups. And the organisers of the festival were adamant that they didn't want plastic. They'd already moved to paper cups years ago because they wanted not to have plastic cups. So even reusable plastic cups they didn't want. So we looked at using stainless steel cups. And the only stainless steel cups you get were in foreign sizes. They were made in China. They were and then imported to wherever you were using them. Mainly imported to the US. And you look at the environmental footprint of that, it's not great. So, excuse me, I'm going to walk to the back and get one of the cups. so what we did was we actually worked with a UK manufacturer and supplier who already supplied us with steel water bottles, which Shambhala also use, and we had our own cup made to a UK specification, to a pint specification. So I'm going to pass it around, people have a look at. So that's made by by a company that usually makes automotive parts. Sorry, it's got a bit of coffee in the bottom of it. I've been using it today. And there were real big challenges with not only with the design and the production of that cup, but also with people within the festival who were worried about what's going to happen if we start using these. How is the system going to work? Is it going to reduce sales of alcohol over the bars? if the bar company that runs the bars starts to lose money, what is that? If you use those on some bars and not on others, people are going to migrate from those bars to the ones that aren't using them because they don't like them. And we had to address all of these issues, and it's still going on to a certain extent. But they've ordered 200,000 of these cups now, which will be used in the public bars at Glastonbury Festival this year. And depending on how that goes, we'll have more in future years. And who knows, maybe the whole site will use reusable stainless steel cups eventually. And this has been a process which has been largely internal. Nobody really, apart from, I keep banging on about it, but nobody else really has put this out in the public domain and discussed it with the customers. It's mainly about getting it right first, internally, making sure it's going to work, and then when the customer turns up and they see it, they think, yeah, I like that. I actually want that. I'd prefer to have that than what was here already. And take it a step further. I think my personal feeling is that if you go to a food stand, most of the food that's been purchased at that market stall is probably eaten within about 50 yards of that market stall. But then you've got loads of disposable packaging that gets chucked in the bin. So why can't you use reusable steel packaging for your food as well, and take it back to the place that you got it from, because you've not actually strayed that far away from it anyway. But this is just, you need to prove this, so you need to study people's behaviour on site and find out, do they actually stay close to the place where they bought the food, or do they wander to the other side of the site? Because if they do, that changes it completely. That changes the sort of process that you need to put in place completely. So, and one more example. So one more example was when I was at the Eurosonic Festival in the Netherlands earlier on this year, and I met Stephanie from Tolwood Festival in Germany. And this is a big festival which runs, I think, for 11 days. So it's a long festival. It's got and it's in an urban location, but it's in an open space. So the infrastructure is very similar to a greenfield festival, except that it's in a city. And in contrast to what Livy is doing at Shambhala, they wanted to promote vegetarian food and reduce the amount of meat that was being sold. And what they did was they have two big food courts. One, they're both in massive frame tents, and the biggest one they put solely over to vegetarian organic food, and they didn't tell anybody. They just did it, and they chose, as Shambhala does, they chose their suppliers very carefully and to try and get the best quality, and they doubled the amount of people who bought vegetarian food, because people wanted to go into that tent because the food was better than in the other one. But they hadn't told anybody that it was all vegetarian. They hadn't made it an issue for the customer. So in that respect, it's completely the opposite to if you were at Shambhala or the Green Gathering, where the audience probably wants to participate in that discussion beforehand. But at Tolwood Festival, it wouldn't have worked that way, especially in Germany. German people like to eat meat, and starting an argument about vegetarianism in Germany is not a great way to win fans of your festival. But to offer them a really nice vegetarian option is.
Great, thanks very much, Rob. So just to say thank you very much to the panel for talking so clearly about their practical experiences around disrupting complacency. And what I think we've realised is the flip side to complacency is fear. So through communicating either internally or externally, do it effectively, make it easy for people, make things better quality, and vision is really important no matter what you do. So thank you very much to the panel, and we'll pass over to the next one.